All right, so since there's been some talk of Brendan Schaub potentially fighting again, I thought now would be a good time to take a look back at the intervention Joe Rogan gave him to get him to stop fighting, because this was obviously a pivotal moment in Brendan's life and career, and it's probably one of the most intense podcasts of all time. I mean, this was only 2 days after Brendan's last fight, where he got TKO'd in round 1 by Travis Brown. So going into this, Brendan was already depressed, and then Joe started telling him he's not as talented as the other fighters in his division, and he should just retire. So obviously nobody would handle that well, especially during a live podcast with a huge audience listening. So I respect that Brendan agreed to do this on the podcast, even though I'm not sure he knew what he was getting himself into. But Joe said they discussed it a little bit before the show. But then once Joe brought it up, Brendan seemed surprised. And at one point, Brendan's like, man, why did we have to do this on the podcast? And Joe said, well, dude, you said you wanted to do it on here. And then Brendan's like, well, I didn't think it'd go like this. So I don't know what they really discussed beforehand, but they definitely did talk about it. And I know Joe wanted to do this publicly because he wanted this to kind of be a PSA to all fighters, even though obviously he supports fighting and he thinks people should be allowed to do it. But I think he just wanted to make people aware of the repercussions that come with fighting. And since Brendan is one of his best friends, he feels more comfortable saying all this stuff to him. And he said he just couldn't watch Brendan take any more brain damage. Like you said, if Brendan continued to fight, he probably wouldn't be able to call his fights anymore, because also Brendan had other career opportunities. You know, he wasn't just relying on fighting. Like around this time, the Fighter and the Kid podcast was really taking off. And I think Brendan said he's making about the same amount of money podcasting as he was in the UFC. So it was not worth it for Brendan to continue fighting. But obviously trying to convince him of that was not easy, because right after you lose at something, nobody wants to hear how bad you did and what you could have done better and how everybody's better than you. But that's what Joe basically said to Brendan. And I'll say Brendan did handle it pretty well. You know, most fighters I think would have walked out or hit Joe or something. Like I know Rampage Jackson absolutely despised Joe Rogan for years, because when Joe would call his fights, he would criticize his leg kicks or something like that, even though Joe would say he's a great fighter. But just Joe criticizing one small part of his game would set him off, and he hated Joe for it. So the fact that Brendan was able to sit through this whole podcast while Joe just completely trashed his fighting skills is pretty respectable. You know, most people would not be able to do that. But I think Brendan said Joe is pretty much the only person in the world he would let talk to him like that. And Brendan would get defensive, but I think anybody would.
As I'm watching the fight, there's a lot of things that concerned me. You were lunging with like your punches instead of getting there with your footwork and then launching things from the proper distance. You were like really reaching and loading up. You looked very stiff. You looked very stiff. You didn't look fluid. You know, you just didn't look good. It didn't look like you were well prepared. Like your movement just didn't look like an elite fighter's movement. What you were doing was very, very stiff. It was very stiff, and it was like a lot of apprehension in your movement. And, you know, obviously you're dealing with a guy who can strike very fast, and you have to be like very careful of not committing or not leaving exposed openings. And, you know, I was worried about you coming into this fight. I can tell you that right now. I was worried because I think Travis Brown's one of the most dangerous guys in the division. I mean, he might have lost to Fabricio Verdum. Verdum's a beast, you know. Verdum's elite. I just worry. This is the reality of it. I worry about your commitment to fighting, and I worry about where you stand. Not your commitment to training. Not your commitment to training, not your commitment to give it your all. I think you have one foot out the door. I think you're looking. You disagree? Mm-hmm. I think you're looking at where the future is going to take you, and that you can't do this forever. You know, and I think that's a very dangerous place to be in fighting. But that's a part of the issue with fighting. There's people in fighting that do really well in the beginning because they're dumb. And this is what I mean by that. Really intelligent guys have to process a lot of variables. You have to process more variables than a guy who doesn't think about the future. Those reckless, crazy guys that happen to be athletically gifted, they just can put all that shit aside and go out there and perform. And and as long as they get the right opponents and as long as they have the right results, that feeds that invulnerability, and they can do fine. You're a smart dude. And the problem with smart dudes is smart dudes think about variables. You have to think about the future. You also think about brain damage. You think about concussions. You think about how many you've already had, how many you got coming up, how much damage you're taking in training. When does damage start to show up in your life? Like when does it show up? and how much can you mitigate, and how far is it when you're too far?
Name an old school fighter you've seen. You're like, God, that guy's sharp.
Exactly.
Said no one ever.
None. Said no one ever.
No one ever.
But you are, you're a sharp dude, and so I know that if you keep going, that's coming. There's no way around that.
True.
And the reality of your skill set and where you at now, I don't see you beating the elite guys. I don't see you beating Cain Velasquez. I don't see you beating Junior Dos Santos. I don't see you beating Fabricio Verdum. Fluidity to their movement that you don't really have. And it's not that you don't try hard. It's not that you're not dedicated. It's not that you're not disciplined. It's not that you're not intelligent. There's shit that other people can do that you can't do.
I don't know if I agree with
Don't you consider yourself a fairly decent striker, right? You consider yourself a fairly decent striker?
Yeah.
Right? How good do you think, like your punches are in comparison to like an elite high-level kickboxer, like a Joe Schilling, or at a wrestling match with Cain Velasquez, how well do you think you do?
Straight up wrestling?
Yeah.
I think people would be surprised.
Really? You think so?
Mm-hmm.
I think you'd be surprised.
Mm.
I really do. I think he'd fuck you up. And I say that as a friend and a guy who loves you. I think he's just on another level.
That's a classic moment right there, and how Brendan got the name for his first comedy special. But I think Brendan here kind of knows he's not on the same level as these other fighters. But when somebody comes at you like this, you almost have to get defensive, especially right after you just lost the fight. So I think Joe's right when he said Brendan has one foot out the door. Like, even at the beginning of this podcast, Brendan said before his last fight, he just wasn't feeling it anymore. He wasn't as hyped as he normally was.
Sense of like, you're ready to go, but it's just not, I don't know. There's like not this fear in you. And I'm like, all right, well, that'll go away. Once I hit the crowd, we're good, man. It's all straight. Once I hit the crowd, I'll get amped up. Here we go. I hit the crowd, and it's literally like it didn't come. I just hit the crowd, and you look at my face, and I'm like, oh, it's like I'm going to walk my dog.
But then like 10 minutes after this, when Joe said he had one foot out the door, Brendan denied it, even though it definitely sounds like that's true. But I think once Joe started criticizing him, it made him want to prove Joe wrong and continue fighting. So I think Joe's strategy might have backfired a little bit here, because also now Brendan claims going into this podcast he was ready to retire.
I told Brian, I go, all right, dude, but I don't want to talk about the fight. Like, I'm kind of messed up from him. I'm depressed, man. I don't want to talk about it. He's not going to do that. We're not even talking about it.
You had already decided to hang him up before that?
Yeah, because I've been doing Fighting the Kid at that point for about 3 years.
Yeah.
And I was starting to receive a good amount of income from that. And, it was just,
the actual
he just told me to
conversation.
stop fighting. He was like, I can tell you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and you're going to get hurt,
You just
man.
called your shit out right there.
Yeah,
It's
in
like,
front of
Off
everyone.
camera. What happened after camera? Like, so the whole
He
thing's done.
hugged me. And
Okay,
we
that's what I
were
figured.
both pretty
Yeah.
teary-eyed. Yeah, he hugged me. And was
It's
like,
very
He
obvious.
was like, I know that was harsh, man, but I
Yeah.
love you, man.
So I don't really believe that, but it would be funny if that was the case, if he's ready to retire. But then Joe started trashing his fighting skills, and he's like, oh, now I want to prove him wrong, and I'm going to continue. Even though he obviously did end up retiring. But I think Joe maybe did go a little overboard here, because I think Joe criticizing Brendan's fighting did just make him want to continue. But I think Joe's just trying to say the way Brendan fights and who he's fighting, there's really no way to avoid getting serious head injuries. But Joe is right. Brendan, he just was not on the same level as these other guys, and there's no way he was going to become champion.
If I was objective and I was standing outside looking at it from the outside and I had a bet, I would have to bet on him. This sucks for you. It's hard to hear.
That's maybe the worst show I've ever done.
It's hard to hear, but
I don't necessarily, and you know me, you're my boy. I don't agree with everything you're saying either.
okay. You watch like John Jones is a perfect example. He's not a little guy. He's 205 pounds, but he's throwing head kicks and stepping in with elbows and side kicks to the body and shoots takedowns, and that's an elite world-class fighter. He's completely unpredictable, completely creative in there. And that's not what you're doing. You're not fighting at that level. And he is even going to get damaged. Everyone's going to get damaged. Everyone's going to get hit. I worry more about you than I do about them, because I think that you leave more openings, you have more vulnerabilities. Of comparing yourself to the other guys in the division, the Fabricio Verdums, the Junior Dos Santoses, the Cain Velasquez, the guys who are at the top of the mountain, they're performing at a different level than you. So it sucks, right? It sucks for me to say it. If I don't like it coming out of my mouth. I don't like it. And the reason why I don't like it is because I love you as a human being. But if 20 years from now you can't fight, like, when can you stop? Can you stop in 10 years? Can you stop in 5 years? Can you stop in 2 years? Can you stop? It's coming. The end is coming. It's the reality of being a fucking demolition derby car. I mean, that's what you are when you're an MMA fighter.
You're not going out like this. You don't want to.
You know, just.
Anyway, you got it. We'll just.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Listen, I'm sorry. I mean, you say that, like you're joking around, but you.
No, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
No,
it's.
I think the point has been made, and this is your life. You're going to make your choices. You're a smart guy. You know what you're doing. You know what you're capable of, and it's your life.
Nobody
it's
rides for free, man.
It's your decision.
You don't ride for free. Nobody rides for free. And not in the world of fighting. Everybody pays. You pay. Every time you get hit, boom.
Do
Every
you
time in
think?
training,
Do you think that Rory McDonald is going to?
And then Brian changes the subject because it's just getting too uncomfortable. And they do get back to it, but it's funny. At one point, they talk about CM Punk because his first UFC fight is coming up. He transitioned from WWE to UFC, and he really had no real fighting background, and he should not have been fighting in the UFC. He got his ass kicked the only 2 fights he had. But it's interesting they talk about him on this podcast specifically because it's very similar to Brendan's transition into comedy. Like, Joe and Brian are arguing about if it's fair that CM Punk can just join the UFC and get on a main pay-per-view fight card right away just because he's already famous in something else, which is just like Schaub going into comedy and getting a Showtime deal his second year. And it's funny, CM Punk had 2 fights that were both a disaster, and Brendan Schaub, he had 2 comedy specials that, some would say were the biggest disaster. But it's just wild hearing Joe and Brian talk about this on the podcast. It's kind of foreshadowing Brendan's career.
World. But should he be able to fight in the #1 organization in the world in his first fight? Honestly, no.
Yeah.
He's in there because he's famous.
It's a little insulting to guys who work their way up to the UFC in a way. I mean,
kind of, but he's a huge star.
Yeah,
and
but
so he earned, I think, his right because of his celebrity status and the eyes he could bring to the sport. He earned his right.
See, I don't agree with that. And the reason I don't agree with that is because the UFC is a fighting organization where you go to see the most elite fighters in the world. And so when you have someone like CM Punk who's now put in the octagon as a sideshow, you could say the same thing. If you're gonna put CM Punk, then let's get Brad Pitt in there, have him train and fight somebody else as well. There are a lot of actors that train. It's more than entertainment. In my opinion, it's a great sport at its peak, and that's how I feel about MMA. Because I think to be a good MMA fighter, and I've watched what Brendan puts himself through, it just takes everything. And that's why I think that area and what makes the UFC and what makes MMA so special at that level is detracted from. And then maybe I'm being too much of a purist, and it's fine that he's fighting in there, but I don't know. I don't like it.
Yeah, so I just thought it was pretty funny that they talked about that on the podcast, but then they get back to talking about Brendan, and you could tell he's just so defeated. He does not want to hear it anymore.
No.
Brendan's been very quiet.
Well, we just told him some shit that's
No,
super
not about that.
uncomfortable.
I'm talking
Almost
about CM
shitted
Punk.
on me, I would say.
I didn't shit on you.
Little bit, my
you,
man.
Nope.
Little bit,
Nope,
brother.
not at all.
Little bit.
Not at all. If I
Little
was
bit.
going to shit on you,
You
it
gonna
would
shit on
be
me now?
a lot. No, I'm not going to. But if I was going to, it would be a lot harsher. Everybody has an end to their story. You gotta. If you can decide when your end is without it being decided for you, it's very empowering.
George Foreman lost to Muhammad Ali. He went into a depression for 5 years or something he almost never came out of.
You guys have sent me down that road right now.
No, man.
Damn near.
No,
Damn
no.
near.
Listen,
That's not the idea. That's not the idea. You're talking. You know what it is? You just got 2 friends who are watching out for you.
probably didn't anticipate how it was going to feel when you said you wanted to have this conversation on the air.
You don't look bad.
You look
And
great.
you don't sound bad.
You're fine.
I'm talking about
Well,
as a person.
Yeah, man,
Yeah.
I'm fine.
Yeah, I'm talking about when we talk to you this way. It's like, if anything, it makes you more likable, and it's an opinion. It's an opinion. Okay, it's just an opinion from Joe, who's watched a lot of fights. It's not fun to hear, and you are going to fight again. Okay, so it was said.
And I'm sure there's people, I knew it when I was about to say it. I was like, here we go. I'm sure there's people listening to this right now. Like, you shouldn't have said this on the air. You have to. There's no other way. There's no other way. You can't dance around it, because if you dance around it, you don't really say it. You can't say it other ways. And that other fighters are out there, that other kids are out there that are thinking about fighting, that they don't know that this is the reality of fighting. It's a huge disservice to the human beings that are participating in fighting to not express this. And this has never been expressed by Jim Lampley. This has never been expressed by Max Kellerman, guys who I think are awesome. They don't have podcasts where they sit around and talk about this to a fighter. And it's because of the fact that people don't. It never gets discussed, and then it just sort of happens. And then one day, you're that guy that we all know that tells the same goddamn story every 5 minutes and doesn't realize you just told that story.
So this obviously ended up being a huge podcast, and it was a Fighter and the Kid podcast. Most people thought it was Joe's, but they were just using Joe's studio to record it. And a lot of articles were written about it. It was a big story. Everybody was talking about it. And I would imagine this is one of the most popular Fighter and the Kid podcasts. But by the end of it, Brendan sounded like he was definitely going to continue fighting, which is funny because going into it, it sounded like he was at least thinking about announcing his retirement. They said they talked about it beforehand. I don't know what exactly they talked about, but by the end of the podcast, it definitely sounded like Brendan was going to fight again. And also, pretty soon after this podcast, maybe just like a week later, there's another one they did with Eddie Bravo as well. And Eddie asked if Brendan was going to continue fighting, and he's like, oh, definitely. And then he starts staring at Joe, like almost just to spite Joe.
What do you want to do,
whole body.
Brendan? I mean, have you decided? Or are you like on the fence? Or are you for sure fighting?
For sure fighting.
Oh, okay.
Not even up for discussion. Yeah.
I would.
You guys can keep talking about it. Yeah, for sure.
At this point.
That's defensive, Brendan.
Yeah.
Hear that tone?
No, I'm just,
at this point, it would be about.
So I think Joe going really hard criticizing Brendan's fighting skills might have backfired a little bit and made Brendan want to continue even more. And I think Joe kind of realized that. And during this podcast, he says he wishes he went about it in a different way because Brendan got so much heat. But it sounded like in the moment during that podcast, Joe was getting really nervous that Brendan wasn't going to listen to him. So he wanted to just be brutally honest and let him know what he thought.
to me.
I had a ton of people reach out to me and thank me for having that conversation, both fighters, trainers, former fighters, just across the board. So many people don't want to have that conversation. They just don't, because we all know it's real, and it's the monster in the room that nobody talks about. The good part about doing that is that it gets this conversation out there. The bad part about doing that is you took a lot of heat, and I feel real bad for that. I feel like I really up for that. And I didn't go into that intending to approach it like that. But it seemed like when we started talking, I started getting more worried that your perception of how the fight went down and the future and what's going on as far as the amount of damage that you've taken is very different than how I see it and how a lot of other people see it. And
so then after all this, I think around a year later, Brendan was doing a fight companion with Joe, and he finally decided to announce his retirement. And this was also around the time UFC signed that Reebok deal, which made it so fighters couldn't get their own sponsors anymore, so they're losing out on a lot of money. So that was another factor that led to Brendan's retirement. And then also just the fact that he was doing well with podcasting and everything else, and he was making more money doing that.
It comes down to this. I can't see myself in a fucking Reebok kit walking out to that octagon. I can't see myself being like, you know what? Cool, man. Yeah, that's what I'm worth. I'm worth 10 grand to you guys. I'm going to do this, And I have other opportunities. And everything I have, and people think I'm this hater on the UFC or whatever, I owe it to the UFC, man. I'll always be indebted to the UFC. But for right now, I got to take a step away and focus on this crazy freaking entertainment podcast career I got going on, man. I'm so blessed.
And that was definitely the right move to make. I mean, if he continued fighting, nothing good would have come of that. Him and Joe talked about it again, I think 3 or 4 years after this. And Joe's like, thank God I got you to stop fighting. And Brendan's like, yeah, that was definitely the right move.
I was real scared that was going to happen to you. I was real scared, I didn't anticipate when we did that crazy podcast that wound up being this intervention. I didn't even know I was going to do it. But while it was happening, I was like, you got to stop. That's all I was thinking is you got to get out. Because we were a little high.
Yeah.
It came out dicky. I know it did, and I know I apologize then and I apologize now.
But I
was
think
just
that's the
scared,
only way
man.
you could do it.
I knew
like
you
that's-
weren't going to listen. I knew you had this pride, like you were like we were talking about before the show. You were a top 10 professional heavyweight in the biggest organization in the world.
That's the only way that you could have done it, because the ego that I had at the time, especially fighting, man, getting to that level, it was like that ego's insane. The narcissist and the dream of, oh, I can beat Kane or Stipe, these guys. And I think the only way that I could have bridged that gap is by you going so hard in the paint. You know?
Dude, I was so scared about Ngannou. I was so scared they were going to fight you with Ngannou or someone like that. You know what I mean? I was so scared you were going to get murked by some when you weren't all in anymore.
So that's pretty much the story on how Joe Rogan convinced Brendan Schaub to stop fighting. And it looks like Joe might have to have this talk with him again, because he has been getting some serious offers recently. He claims they're offering him millions of dollars. And one of those fights might be Derek Lewis in a bare knuckle boxing match. And I think he said head stomps would be legal. So that would not be good. I mean, that'd be hard to watch. And I don't think Joe would let that happen. It would be ridiculous if 10 years later, after all this, he decides to go and fight Derek Lewis. That'd be such a bad idea. You know, I think if he's in a fight again, he should just do some celebrity exhibition boxing match against like Louis J. Gomez or some other comedian. But let me know what you guys think about it all down in the comments. And then make sure you go check out my Patreon account. There are probably over 35 videos on there at this point, and most of them are pretty long and similar to this kind of style. So if you like this video, make sure you check that out for exclusive content. You know, I talk about Michael Richards, you know, Kramer's infamous meltdown at the Laugh Factory, the downfall of Milo Yiannopoulos, some of the cringiest Joe Rogan Experience episodes, like one with Amy Schumer. So if you want to hear about any of that, make sure you go check out the Patreon account, and then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.